Everyone's grandpa said the same thing. Renting is throwing money away. But here's a number that might make your grandpa a little uncomfortable. In some cities today, someone who rents and invests the difference can end up wealthier after 10 years than someone who bought a house. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough that just buy a house might be the worst financial advice you've never questioned. Today, we're breaking the whole thing down with real numbers, real scenarios, and the one simple rule that tells you which side of this argument you're actually on. Quick note before we go further, this video is for information and entertainment. It's not personalized financial advice. Your own city, income, and life plans change the math completely. Now, let's get into it. Let's start with the myth. Renting is dead money and buying is building equity. Sounds simple. It's not true, or rather, it's only sometimes true, and most people never check which sometimes they're in. Here's what that myth conveniently ignores. When you rent, you're paying for a real service, a place to live tonight, with no responsibility if the water heater explodes at 2 a.m. And you're avoiding property taxes, maintenance costs, and something almost nobody accounts for, the opportunity cost of your down payment. That last one is the sneaky part. If buying a home means locking up $60,000, $80,000, maybe $150,000 into a down payment, that's money that isn't sitting in an index fund quietly compounding. Whether renting or buying wins financially depends entirely on what that money would have earned instead. So the real question was never renting or buying. It's, what does the actual math say in your specific market for your specific timeline? There's a shortcut financial analysts use, popularized by finance educator Ben Felix, called the 5% rule, and it's genuinely useful. Here's how it works. Take the value of a home you're considering, multiply it by 5%, then divide by 12. That gives you a monthly break-even rent. That 5% breaks down into 3 rough pieces, about 1% for property taxes, 1% for maintenance, and 3% for the opportunity cost of having your money tied up in the house instead of invested elsewhere. So let's say you're eyeing a $400,000 home. 5% of that is $20,000 a year, or about $1,667 a month. If you could rent a similar home for less than that, the math currently favors renting. If comparable rent is well above that number, buying starts looking better. There's a second shortcut worth knowing, the price-to-rent ratio. Take a home's price and divide it by the annual rent for a similar place. Below 15, buying is usually favored. Above 20, renting usually wins. Between 15 and 20, it's genuinely a toss-up that depends on the details. Let's make this concrete with 2 scenarios that actually show up in the data. Scenario 1, the affordable market. A $320,000 home with comparable rent around $2,000 a month, a 20% down payment, and a 6.5% mortgage rate. In this market, the price-to-rent ratio comes out around 13, well under that 15 threshold. Run the full math over 7 years and buying comes out roughly $45,000 ahead of renting. The break-even point, the year buying starts winning, arrives in about 3.5 years. Scenario 2, the expensive market. A $1.2 million home with comparable rent around $3,800 a month, a 10% down payment, and the same 6.5% rate, but this time you're only planning to stay 4 years. Here, renting wins, and it's not close. The price-to-rent ratio in expensive coastal markets can run well above 20, sometimes even above 30, and the upfront costs of buying simply don't have enough time to pay themselves off before you'd be selling again. Same interest rate, same buyer, completely different answer, because the market and the timeline changed everything. And here's the number that surprises most people, using national averages for a typical American market. A $400,000 home, 20% down, 6.5% rate, modest 3% home appreciation, and a conservative 4% return if that down payment had been invested instead. The break-even point lands around year 12. Stay in the home past that point, and buying usually wins. Sell before it, and renting typically comes out ahead once you account for selling costs. Here's where it gets even more interesting. This isn't just a city-by-city question, it's a country-by-country one, and the differences are massive. Within the U.S. alone, coastal metro areas like San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles tend to have high price-to-rent ratios, meaning renting is often the financially smarter move there. Meanwhile, many Midwest and Sunbelt cities have much lower ratios, where buying tends to win. Same country, opposite answers, purely because of local price-to-rent math. Now zoom out to the whole world, and it gets even wider. Some countries, including Portugal, Hungary, and Mexico, have seen house prices grow so much faster than rents over the past decade that buying has become dramatically less attractive there than it used to be. And then there's homeownership rate itself, which varies for reasons that have nothing to do with the math we just walked through. Kazakhstan has the highest homeownership rate in the world at 98%. China sits at 96%. Romania, Albania, and Slovakia all sit above 90%. In several of these countries, that's less about buying beating renting financially, and much more about history. Large-scale privatization of state-owned housing after the fall of communism left millions of families owning their homes outright, with a weak rental market ever developing in the first place. Compare that to cities where renting is culturally normal and expected for decades of adult life, even among wealthy residents. Think Berlin or Tokyo, and you can see that should I rent or buy doesn't just depend on your income. It depends on which country's housing history you were born into. So before you run any calculator, the very first input should be which city and which country. The 5% rule and the price-to-rent ratio still apply everywhere, but the number you'll actually get out of them can look completely different depending on where you live. Here's what home buying content on social media rarely mentions. Selling a home isn't free. Realtor commissions and closing costs on the way out typically eat up 7 to 8% of the sale price. If you sell a $400,000 home, that's roughly $28,000 to $32,000 gone before you even calculate whether you made money. Maintenance isn't optional either. That 1% of home value per year estimate in the 5% rule isn't a worst case. It's the average. Roofs, water heaters, and HVAC systems don't ask whether it's convenient. And then there's the one nobody likes to say out loud: mobility. If a better job shows up 2 states away, a renter can move in a month. A homeowner has to sell first, or become a landlord with everything that involves. None of this means buying is bad. It means the equity story is incomplete, unless you also count what it cost you to get in, and what it'll cost you to get out. So, renting or buying? The honest answer is the one nobody wants to hear in a headline. It depends on how long you're staying and what your local price-to-rent ratio actually is. Stay long in an affordable market, and buying usually wins. Stay short in an expensive market, and renting usually wins, often by a lot. The myth was never really about money. It was about certainty. Buying is always right is just easier to say than run the numbers for your situation. But now you know the actual rule. The 5% test and the price-to-rent ratio take about 30 seconds to calculate for any home you're considering. If this saved you from a decision you hadn't actually run the numbers on, subscribe.